Is Tubeless worth the hassle and worth the expense in upgrading your road bike this year? It's easy to think it's a really expensive technology fraught with hassle and installation woes, and you're better off sticking with inner tubes, and you might well be after I've gone through 6 reasons why Tubeless might not be ready for the road bike market just yet. Easily the biggest hurdle to tubeless adoption is the lack of standards and the issue of compatibility between rims and tyres. Now, fitting an inner tube to a bicycle wheel is fairly straightforward, especially if you watch the video up here, and most of you know how to do it, and it's a job you can very easily learn as well. But tubeless isn't quite as simple as that and does require a steeper learning curve to get happy doing a tubeless setup. But it shouldn't really be this difficult. It's just fitting a tyre to a rim, pretty straightforward. But over the years, there's been no uniform standard, but not for lack of trying. Shimano tried about 10 years ago with road tubeless, but nobody else adopted it. And then Mavic tried to push their road UST, which is really popular on mountain biking, into the road bike market, but nobody adopted that either. So we've been left with this absolute mess of compatibility with rims and tyres not playing together at all. And if you get lucky and get a tyre and a rim that work together, happy days, no problems at all. But while that's one end of the spectrum, at the other end, you can have a complete nightmare and tyres that are near impossible to fit on a rim. I won't name any names, but I'm sure you know which brands I'm talking about. And if you've had that bad experience, where it's a case of once bitten, twice shy, as I say, definitely enough to put you off tubeless forever. Now, in recent years, we are getting to a place of a uniform standard. The ETRTO and the ISO, the governing bodies for not just bicycles, but all motor vehicles in terms of tyre and rim dimensions, have come together and given us a standard that the tyre and wheel brands are working towards. And in my experience, the latest wheels and tyres do work together, do play together really well, thankfully, and installation is as easy as a normal inner tube setup. No special tricks or tools needed, the way it should have been 10 years ago. If you have a problem with tubeless, is that the sealant sloshing around inside the wheel, which is very often great at sealing small holes like thorns and glass, very often can't seal anything bigger than those small holes. A slasher sidewall or a big hole from a nail, it just can't seal it. And then you are in a world of trouble. Sealant spraying out everywhere, going over your body, the person behind you, sticking to your frame and leaving you a flat tyre. And you either have to get creative and use a tubeless plug tool like one of these and learn how to use one of these, which look very strange if you've never seen one before, or take off a tyre and put an inner tube in, or phone home for a taxi. Not as easy as popping a new inner tube in and riding home, I know. And for that small risk of getting a puncture that's big enough that the sealant and even the tubeless plugs can't fix, that you still have to carry an inner tube or two just in case that 1% chance happens and you get a puncture that a tubeless system can't fix itself. There is a possible solution on the horizon though. We now have the advent of foam inserts, which have been used by the World Tour teams at races like Paris-Roubaix. And they essentially offer the benefits of a run flat system like cars use. So rather than rely on carrying an inner tube with you, you have this foam insert in the tyre, and if you get a puncture, well, apparently you can carry on riding. I haven't tried them myself, I have some in for review, so watch this space. Very keen to see what they're all about, and if you can ride with a flat tyre, but get home or to a nearest bike shop to fix a tubeless puncture with the foam inserts inside them. You've probably all seen a tubeless explosion or a bicycle frame covered in sealant on the internet or up close in person. And the mess of a tubeless setup is enough to put lots of people off, and I totally get that. Compared to an inner tube where there is no mess, dealing with sealant, which is messy stuff, if you're not careful, it's enough to put most people off. Now, it is possible to run a tubeless tyre without sealant if you get a proper dedicated tubeless tyre and you have an airtight fit with a rim. and it can work just fine. But most tyres now, most tubeless tyres are tubeless ready and aren't fully airtight and have a slightly porous construction in some cases and rely on a sealant to give that airtight fit. But if you're not careful, it can be messy stuff. Depending on your installation, you might have to pour the sealant inside the tyre before you put on the rim, and there's a real risk of getting it all over you, the kitchen floor, and the bike and everywhere but inside the tyre. But there are some solutions to this. With some valves, you can remove the core and use a tube injector like this from Orange Seal to minimise the risk of sealant going everywhere. But if you're not very careful, it can be a messy job, as I know from personal experience. With an inner tube, there's very little to go wrong. Occasionally they fail around the valve, but that's very, very rare. But with sealant, this sealant will dry out over time, or if you have multiple punctures during the time you have the bike set up, will lose your sealant in the tyre. So over the course of 6 months to a year, you will need to check how much sealant you have in your tyre. Now, it can be as messy as removing a tyre or a portion of the tyre from the rim to check visually. Some brands like Orange Seal have a dipstick which goes into the valve so you can leave the tyre on, and that's quite a clever solution. Now, I've made a mistake in the past of riding a bike for quite a while, and only when I changed the tyres for a different pair for testing purposes, realising that the sealant inside was all dried out, all clinging to the sidewall of the tyre. So I had been riding for weeks, maybe months, with no active sealant sloshing around inside the tyre. And it's for that reason you need to check how much sealant you have in your tyre on a regular basis. Another negative to a tubeless setup is the cost of upgrading from a regular inner tube setup. There might be quite a few things you need. You might need, for example, a new set of wheels, some new tyres, you might need some rim tape, you might need some tubeless valves, and you might need some sealant to get the whole setup up and running. Now, you can buy kits like this one here from Muck-Off, not sponsored, loads of others on the market as well. If you're buying a fairly new bike, the rims might already be tubeless ready and it might be sealed as well. Some have a proper sealed rim, some use tape like this to ensure they are airtight, but the tyres likely won't be. So new tyres, and then you need some bottles of sealant, and that can be quite expensive. And it's worth adding that some bike brands are now taking away the cost and the hassle of going to tubeless by installing tubeless wheels, tyres, and everything you need on the bike. Giant, for example, are heavily pushing tubeless on all their top end and mid-range road bikes as well, like new Propel and a TCR as well. So it definitely removes that hurdle to going tubeless. But compared to the expense of going to tubeless, inner tubes are far, far cheaper. And if you do want to upgrade your inner tube setup and get some and most of the performance of a tubeless setup, you can go to a latex inner tube. Save you a bunch of weight. The rolling resistance benefits are very noticeable and very close to the best tubeless setup. But the only downside is you will have to inflate your tyres on a daily basis because they lose air very quickly, even during a ride sometimes as well. And of course, you don't get the puncture prevention benefits of a tubeless setup. So a whole list of negatives and reasons why you might not want to go to a tubeless setup on your road bike. But then, just maybe, the benefits might outweigh all those negatives, and here's a few. Now for me, the biggest benefit and the reason I really stick behind tubeless is the risk of punctures and minimising that risk of punctures on a road ride, especially in the winter when it's cold and wet, and the last thing you want to do is stop by the side of the road, take the wheel out of the frame, take the inner tube out and replace it, and your hands are freezing and you're pumping away with a mini pump. That isn't much fun. And that's why here in the UK, I really prefer tubeless in the winter because it minimises that risk of a puncture. And then because it's so good in the winter, well, I might as well keep riding it during the summer. And then of course, there are the performance benefits of a tubeless setup if the latest studies are to be believed. And that's because you're removing that extra friction that an inner tube inside a tyre creates, and other reasons as well. So clearly, tubeless has a long way to go yet before it becomes universally adopted, if it ever does. But for me personally, the benefits definitely outweigh the negatives but there are a few hurdles to overcome, and definitely worth going into a tubeless upgrade with your eyes wide open about some of the known issues around tubeless. Now, if you want to see a video on how to set up your bike tubeless, then check out this video right here. Eagle Eye viewers will have noticed I've been waving around a bottle of lube thinking it's a bottle of sealant. My mistake, that's actually a bottle of lube, not sealant. These are bottles of sealant.